Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition.
We thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing for future content.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in a truly remarkable work of history, all that she carried. The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, by the masterful historian Tiya Miles.
This is a book that, it performs a breathtaking feat of historical recovery. We really encourage you, after hearing this, to go out and purchase this book and support the author.
Absolutely.
And it is important to note that the voices you hear come from AI, but the content we're presenting, it comes straight from the meticulous research and beautiful writing in the book. We feel that this is just a powerful and accessible way to learn about vital African-American history.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack the story contained within a single, very humble artifact, a cotton sack.
Just a simple cotton sack.
Right. And it was carried by a young woman named Ashley when she was forcibly sold away from her mother, Rose, around 1850.
And that object was then passed down through the generations, finally gaining its text when Ashley's descendant, Ruth, carefully embroidered the names and the tragedy right onto the cloth.
So this small sack becomes a living testament to resilience, to trauma, and to an enduring love across 3 generations of African-American women. We have to start, though, with the environment that manufactured this moment of separation.
We do. And that environment is Charleston, South Carolina, a city that back in the 18th and 19th centuries was just a place of extreme contrast, built on a foundation of horrific injustice.
Let's start right there with the setting. The book describes Charleston's foundation with this chilling phrase, the tragic alchemy of white rice and black bodies.
And the phrase, it just perfectly captures the economic reality. By the early 1700s, Charleston was already one of the oldest colonial settlements, but it was. It was unique.
How so?
It was the blackest, the richest, and maybe most corrosively the most unequal society on the entire continent. This wasn't just a place that used enslaved labor. It was fundamentally defined by it.
And this brings us to a really crucial distinction the book makes. What does it mean to be a slave society versus, say, a society that just has slaves?
That's a distinction historians use to really get at the fundamental character of a place. So, when we talk about a society with slaves, slave labor is maybe just one form of labor among many, and the system might be localized.
Okay.
But in a slave society like antebellum Charleston, slavery was the chief, the indispensable engine of the economy. It was the foundation of the entire social, legal, and political structure. All wealth flowed from it.
So everything was tied to it.
Everything.
Right.
If you were a lawyer, you handled slave sales. If you were a banker, you financed mortgages based on human collateral.
So the economic engine was literally fueled by human beings, and that required a legal structure to strip those people of their humanity.
Precisely. And that legal architecture was embodied in this concept of chattel personal. We really need to break that term down because it is the core legal horror underpinning Rose's entire life.
Chattel. What does that mean exactly?
The word comes from Anglo-French, and it means movable property. By legally defining an enslaved person as chattel personal, the law declared them to be no different from a piece of furniture, a tool, or a horse.
So they were stripped of all rights, they couldn't consent, they couldn't testify against white people, and crucially, they had no legal claim to their own children.
Or their own marriage, correct. Angelina Grimke, who was the abolitionist daughter of a prominent Charleston slaveholding family, she wrote in 1836 that this system reduced a man or a woman like Rose to a thing. It robbed them of all human rights and agency.
It made them an asset that could be traded, mortgaged, or willed away.
Yes, and this legal stripping of identity was absolutely necessary for the economy to function. An economy that was centered on 2 main crops.
Starting with rice.
Rice. It was a foundational crop of Carolina wealth, and it's an intensely labor-intensive crop. It requires precise knowledge of irrigation, sophisticated engineering to manage canals, ditches, water gates.
A lot of skill.
A tremendous amount of skill and meticulous timing. And what's fascinating and, deeply ironic is that the European planters had no experience growing rice.
Right. So where did the knowledge come from?
They had to rely on the sophisticated agricultural knowledge brought by enslaved people imported from regions experienced in rice agriculture, particularly the Windward Coast and Grain Coast, which includes modern-day Sierra Leone. These people, against their will, provided the intellectual capital that built Carolina's richest families.
They were the engineers and the experts, yet they were treated as property. And this was soon followed by the bright rise of cotton.
Exactly. The expansion of upland cotton after the invention of the cotton gin just cemented Charleston's role as a major port for exporting raw goods produced by forced labor. Both rice and cotton were staples that guaranteed immense wealth, but that wealth was secured through a standardized system of brutality.
And the book traces the origins of that standardized brutality back to something called the Barbadian influence. So this wasn't like a homegrown South Carolinian cruelty. It was an imported model.
It was a successful, deeply entrenched blueprint. The Carolina colony's early settlers arrived largely by way of Barbados. Planters there had already perfected the formula for creating the richest colonial society in North America, based entirely on sugar and slaves.
So they brought that system with them.
They did. They had developed the infamous Barbadian Slave Code, which systematically denied rights and regulated every single aspect of the enslaved population's lives to maintain absolute control.
And the early Carolina men basically just copied and pasted that Caribbean plantation model.
That's a good way to put it. They imported the expectation that the workforce would be violently suppressed. This system relied wholly and existentially on the degradation of human beings.
What did that look like in practice?
To maintain a numerical majority or near-majority enslaved population, they institutionalized extreme brutality. Routine whippings, mutilations, public caging, summary executions as a calculated system designed to instill terror and just crush the will to resist.
And it's so important to realize that this violence wasn't just on rural plantations. It permeated the city. The very architecture of Charleston reflected this system of control.
The urban landscape of control is a crucial part of this story. Charleston's aristocratic hierarchy was literally built into the ground.
What do you mean by that?
When the elite areas were established, they used stable, costly soil infill to build their grand mansions. But the outlying neighborhoods, the ones occupied by poor whites and, critically, by enslaved and free black people, they were often built on cheap organic materials. Things like garbage, animal carcasses, waste.
So the very foundation of your home was a reflection of your place in society. The ground itself reinforced the social structure.
Absolutely. The stability and the elevation of the land mirrored your status. And beyond that, you have the walls, the beautiful, tall brick walls that today define the historical aesthetic of Charleston. They weren't just decorative.
No, the urban estates functioned like prisons.
Very much so. These walls were weaponized barrier fences, designed to prevent freedom of movement, communication, and, most importantly, escape.
They also had a psychological function, right, to hide the day-to-day operations of this terror.
They did. These high walls veiled the sights and sounds of the horrors that were rampant within the domestic sphere. The physical abuse, the psychological manipulation, the pervasive sexual exploitation. They gave the owners an air of comfort and privacy, allowing them to believe in their own gentility while the cruelty continued just out of sight.
And after the Denmark-Vesey rebellion plot in 1822, these walls became even more physically hostile.
Yes. The threat of an organized revolt led to enhanced architectural defenses. After the failed Vesey plot, which, exposed the constant underlying fear of the white population, masters directed that these beautiful brick walls be spangled on their upper ledges with sharp barbs of break-in bottles.
So they're literally covered in glass.
Glittering shards that made scaling the walls treacherous, reinforcing the barrier.
And the psychological impact of these walls, the book says, was profound for the enslaved.
It forced the enslaved to focus entirely on the master's world. It denied them sightlines of freedom, preventing them from seeing beyond the confines of their immediate oppression, and hindering their ability to plot resistance or even just find a moment's respite.
This is the intensely controlled, violently structured, and economically ruthless world into which Rose and her daughter Ashley were born at 16 Charlotte Street.
Oh, Leslie.
So to go from this broad, terrifying canvas to the intimate tragedy of Rose and Ashley, that requires some incredible historical detective work. Finding individuals like them is described as walking through an archival shadowland.
That phrase just perfectly encapsulates the difficulty of historical recovery in this period. Finding specific enslaved people is a monumental task, a process hampered by what historians call the archival deficit.
Let's talk about that, the archival deficit. Why is the record so thin and unreliable when it comes to enslaved women?
Well, because the records were never designed to record human lives. They were designed to track property.
Documents, bills of sale, inventories, plantation ledgers. They're inherently blood documents, as the book says, produced at the expense of real lives. They are slippery and unforthcoming about crucial details like parentage, birth dates, or a person's inner life.
So they're just names on a list.
If that. Enslaved women, in particular, often appear only as first names, tied only to a monetary value or a task.
So, if the records are so hostile to personhood, how in the world did Rose and Ashley's names survive the silence of history?
Their survival it's a historical miracle, really. And it's due almost entirely to the object itself, to Ruth Middleton's active embroidery generations later.
Ah, so it all comes back to the sack.
It all comes back to the sack. The fact that Ruth stitched the names Rose and Ashley onto it provided the critical historical clue.
And the book notes that the name Rose was incredibly common, which wouldn't have been enough on its own to find them.
No, a search of South Carolina records confirmed that. Nearly 200 roses were listed among enslaved persons in the area. A rose is a historical dead end.
But Ashley wasn't. No. The name Ashley was a true rarity in South Carolina records from that period. The author's exhaustive search of colonial and state documents revealed only 3 Ashleys owned by residents in the entire state.
Wow, only 3.
Only 3. So the presence of Ashley's name, it became the arrow illumined with strings of lights.
That historical methodology is just fascinating. The rarity of Ashley's name allowed the historian to zero in on a very small pool of owners.
Exactly. It allowed them to pinpoint Rose to a specific location in Charleston, the household of Robert Martin. He was a prominent merchant and factor.
A broker.
A broker, yes. He handled large rice and cotton trades on the busy wharves, and his house was located at 16 Charlotte Street.
And Martin seems to perfectly embody that extreme moral bifurcation of the slave society.
He really does. He was listed as a devout professor of the Christian faith, an active Episcopalian congregant, and yet his daily life, his comfort, his wealth, his status, it relied entirely on Rose's labor and her ministrations.
So he maintained this completely bifurcated view.
He had to, believing himself an upstanding, moral man, while simultaneously treating Rose as demoted human property.
So what would Rose's daily life have been like? Where did she live and work?
Her world was the shadow space of the grand house. This was the brick, 2-story dependency located behind the main structure. It housed the kitchen downstairs and the slave quarters upstairs.
A very typical design for urban estates at the time.
Very typical. They kept the labor close, but separated from the white family's main living areas.
And what was Rose's assigned purpose within that domestic sphere? In her owner's mind?
Well, in the owner's mind, her purpose was disturbingly intimate, yet also completely reductive. She was there to serve liqueur and seasoned meat, ease aches and soothe discomforts, embody value, and increase wealth.
So she's a skilled cook, a caretaker, a domestic manager.
Yes, but all of her contributions were measured only in terms of the value they added to Robert Martin's financial and social standing. The relationship was inherently corrupt because of that power dynamic.
And that constant proximity, of course, raises the question of Ashley's parentage.
It does. Given the constant surveillance and the fact that legally recognized marriage was impossible for enslaved people, we can look to the 1840 census for Martin's household. It lists several enslaved males.
So any of them could have been Ashley's father.
They could have been, yes, whether through a loving, unrecognized union or through coercion. But historical accounts, most famously Harriet Jacobs' narrative, show that we must always confront the possibility of sexual predation in slaveholding homes.
So we can't ignore the possibility that Robert Martin himself was the father.
We can't. It was a horrific reality of the system that often went unpunished and unrecorded.
And the ultimate cruel measure of Rose's non-personhood is captured in Robert Martin's estate inventory, right? After his death in the 1850s.
Yes. That inventory is a chilling document. It lists his human property right alongside every piece of his movable wealth. This stark catalog provides a material measure of the system's cruelty and the valuation of a human life.
And Rose is on that list.
She is, valued at $700.
$700. And we really have to emphasize what that meant, to contextualize her value within that economy.
To understand the weight of that figure, you have to look at the comparison items. Rose's value was significant. That $700 placed her above many of the family's other material assets.
For example.
For context, the inventory listed 2 carriages and a harness at $400. 1 cow was $100. A pair of horses, essential for transportation, was valued at just $150.
So she was worth more than a pair of horses and 2 carriages combined.
Far more. And even more heartbreakingly, the value of other enslaved people varied wildly. An old woman was valued at $100, while a strong man named Cicero was valued at $1,000.
So Rose's $700 valuation meant she was a valuable, tradable asset.
Exactly, and that underscores the central horror.
Right.
A living, breathing person, a mother, was just a cash figure on a balance sheet. and that value is what led directly to her sale and the separation from her child.
The sale of that asset meant the immediate severing of the most sacred bond, the mother-child relationship. The book stresses that this threat of separation was the single greatest trauma inflicted by slavery. It was an unrelenting, constant fear.
It was an existential threat that defined every enslaved mother's experience. They weren't just laborers, they were reproductive capital. Their children were future assets that could be removed at any time for economic convenience.
And because of this, the acts of protection that mothers undertook were, well, they were fierce and desperate.
They often required incredible moral and physical courage.
Let's delve into some of those acts of protection because they show the extreme limits of maternal resistance under this system. There is the example of Moses Grandy's mother.
Yes, Moses Grandy, who was formerly enslaved in North Carolina, he recalled how his mother lived under this perpetual fear. When she sensed a trader might be coming, or if she suspected her master was financially stressed and considering a sale, she would often take all her children and hide them deep in the woods.
Just to buy some time.
To buy some time. It was an attempt, however temporary, to prevent their immediate removal and dispersal. The woods were a place of danger, of course, but also a brief refuge from the systematic violence of the plantation.
And the length of time mothers would remain hidden were just astounding.
There's another incredible account of a mother who escaped and lived in the woods for 2 to 4 years with her children, actively dodging slave catchers and surviving off the land. This mother was so committed to keeping her family together that she even gave birth to another child while hiding underground.
Wow.
This wasn't passive resistance. This was a sustained, dangerous, and incredibly arduous commitment to family preservation.
And the story of Fanny is maybe the most shocking example of using an act of threat and violence to leverage a small victory against the owner.
Fanny was an enslaved mother in Tennessee. When her master ordered her to leave her infant behind as she was being hired out to Memphis, she made a terrible and a very calculated threat.
What did she do?
Her older daughter, Puss, later recalled that Fanny took the baby by its feet, head swinging downward, and vowed to smash its brains out on the ground before she would allow it to be left behind and orphaned.
That is a breathtaking, shocking display of desperation.
It is. It was a threat of infanticide, a horrific moral calculation, but it was also a supremely political act. Fanny knew that by destroying her child, she would instantly decrease her owner's wealth, the very asset the owner prized most.
And it worked.
The shock and the realization that she meant it were enough for the owner to let her take the child. It illustrates that the will to protect their children superseded even the fear of death.
And the grim finality of Margaret Garner's choice is another defining example of this trauma.
Margaret Garner, yes. Facing re-enslavement after escaping across the Ohio River, she chose a present death for her toddler daughter rather than allowing the child to be returned to the horrors of lifelong bondage.
These maternal acts, hiding, threatening violence, or committing it, were all born out of the absolute existential crisis created by chattel slavery.
They were. And for enslaved mothers, the protection of their daughters carried an added layer of urgency.
Why daughters in particular?
Well, daughters were seen as ties to life, capable of creating new generations. But this also meant they were accruing future life, and thus future assets, to the owner's balance sheet.
I see.
And furthermore, daughters were systemically exposed to the most intimate and pervasive horrors. Not just physical and psychological abuse, but the constant threat of sexual exploitation. Enslaved mothers knew their daughters required special, creatively fierce defenses to circumvent the customs and laws of the slaving society.
Some mothers who had even a small degree of economic leverage used that to secure their daughters' futures.
They did. If they managed to earn a little money through extra work or hiring out on Sundays, they made a special habit of buying and manumitting their daughters, specifically to give them a chance at freedom and safety.
And when they failed to prevent the sale,
They pursued impossible reunions. We have the poignant account of Violet, an enslaved woman who wrote a respectful but incredibly purposeful letter to her former mistress in 1857, years after her daughter had been sold away, just begging for knowledge about the whereabouts of her precious little girl.
the language is deferential, but the purpose is absolute.
Absolutely. To find her child.
For Ashley, that separation likely happened in Charleston, a city where the sale environment itself was a horrifying spectacle.
Charleston was a massive domestic slave trade hub, and visitors often remarked on the contrast between the white opulence and the blatant black diminishment. The British writer Harriet Martineau observed this juxtaposition.
What did she see?
She noted the horrifying sight of children who shrunk in helplessness and shame when they were ordered onto the auction block to be inspected by potential buyers.
She described witnessing this as something that might stagger faith itself.
She did. Martineau vividly recounted moving from the slave market, where she saw mothers with babies being hawked like livestock, to the abodes of the slave masters, bright with sunshine and gay with flowers, courtesies, and mirth. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain both their wealth and their self-image as moral beings was staggering.
And the book uses modern psychological research to help us understand the deep psychological scars this separation left on Ashley and Rose.
That insight is so crucial. We should never imagine that the enslaved went psychologically unscathed by this system. Modern psychological research on separated migrant children who share Ashley's condition of being torn from a parent in a state of extreme threat shows that the experience causes mental health effects on par with beating and torture.
That's a powerful comparison. This trauma is not historical, it is neurologically devastating.
It is, and we see the devastation clearly reflected in the tragic case of Lewis Hayden's mother.
What happened to her?
Lewis Hayden, who would later become a pivotal abolitionist, described the absolute mental break his mother experienced after she was separated from her children. She suffered severe mental distress, experienced fits, and became dangerously unpredictable, behavior that eventually led to her being jailed by her owner.
And when she was released?
When she was released, she immediately found 7-year-old Lewis, caught his arms, and screamed in a fit of desperate, distorted protection, saying, "I'll fix you so they'll never get to you." She attempted to harm him, fearing the system would seize and destroy him first.
Wow.
This extreme reaction shows the deep, destabilizing psychological toll that the violence of slavery and forced separation inflicted on Black mothers. This is the state of mind Rose was in when she prepared Ashley's sack.
When Rose prepared Ashley for sale, she had no control over that horrific business, but she exercised agency over one crucial thing: the contents of that small cotton sack. This brings us to the profound meaning of possessions.
It's so deeply ironic that a society that defined Black people as things forced those same people to invest profound spiritual meaning into the things they owned.
Right.
Although they were crushingly poor, possessing objects acquired through working for hire, bartering, or during their limited off time was crucial. It was a salve that reinforced self-worth and dignity, actively challenging the system that stripped them of personhood.
So the enslaved became, in a way, early theorists of the mercurial nature of things.
They did. They recognized the thin, terrifying boundary line between human and non-human, that people could be treated like things and that things were often prized above people. The objects they owned, even the humblest ones, were invested with personhood and memory. The sack itself is a monument to this contradiction.
Let's look at the sack as an artifact. It's a powerful synecdoche, a part standing for the whole, representing American slavery.
It truly is. The cotton sack, made of slave-grown cotton, was likely manufactured in the North or in England using technology like the power loom. The fact that it was constructed with a double locking chain stitch is eerily symbolic, too.
How so?
That stitch is known for its durability and tightness, mirroring the forced labor ethos of the entire era, a system designed to lock down and contain. This humble sack, intended for the agricultural industry to transport goods, was transformed by Rose into a medicine bundle, renewed and invested with a different kind of value, that of love and remembrance.
And what Rose chose to pack was not arbitrary. The first item is a braid of her hair, an intense act of self-possession.
This choice was radically defiant. Hair was a common tool for asserting control. Slaveholders often dictated hair length or shaved it entirely, especially if the white mistress was jealous. We know from Harriet Jacobs's narrative that her master cut her hair as an act of retribution, separation, and to deliberately deface her allure. By choosing to part with a braid by her own hand, Rose rejected the captor's authority over her body and appearance. It was an act of quiet, radical self-possession.
The significance of hair goes beyond defiance, connecting to broader cultural practices of the era, though with a different meaning.
Yes. In the 1800s, white upper and middle classes engaged in what was called hair work. This involved fashioning hair into sentimental objects like jewelry, chains, or wreaths, specifically to bind separated loved ones, often across the distance of death. It was a physical thread meant to manifest grief and connection.
But for Rose, the braid was far more than just Victorian sentimentality.
It was so much more. For Rose, the braid was a physical tether, a genetic link, a genetic tie to the past. It was a piece of herself, a biological artifact that ensured a cosmic continuity that slavery could not sever. It was a silent, material promise to Ashley that she belonged, and that the person who loved her still existed, embodied in that small, preserved braid.
It's just incredible. And the second item, the seeds, specifically the pecans, also carry these profound layers of significance. They link Ashley not just to her mother, but to the deep indigenous history of the continent.
The pecans are highly valuable artifacts in this context. They were a high-value item, often exotic delicacies, served in Charleston's most expensive restaurants in the 1840s and 50s.
So they were extremely difficult for an enslaved person to obtain.
Extremely difficult, especially in the Southeast, because they were primarily harvested hundreds of miles to the west, growing wild in the Mississippi River Valley.
This suggests Rose went to extraordinary lengths to acquire them for Ashley.
Absolutely. This wasn't something she would just pick up off the ground. She likely had to engage in extensive bartering, perhaps trading highly priced food she had prepared, or she may have come upon them through a fortunate position in the Martin household. The difficulty of getting them just underscores their value as a gift.
But the deeper meaning, as you mentioned, lies in their origin and what they represent.
Yes, pecans have deep Native American roots. Indigenous peoples across the continent, the Palaya, Comanches, Caddos, and Cherokees, travel great distances to gather these nuts. They use them not just for daily sustenance, but for ceremonial drinks and even medicine.
Like what?
They use ground bark and leaves to treat ailments like ringworm and tuberculosis.
So by packing pecans, Rose gave Ashley more than just food. She gave her a connection to a vast pre-colonial history.
It was an incredible act of providing potential for sustenance, the promise of future life and growth. By including these nuts and seeds, Rose implicitly connected Ashley to a natural resource and to the deep indigenous history of the continent, a history that predated the arrival of slavery and the Martin household.
This action positions Rose as what the book calls a seed carrier.
The seed carrier is presented as an alternative archetype to the typical male hunter-hero. This figure, often a woman, is focused on gathering, protecting, and continuation, not destruction or conquest. Rose was investing in the continuation of life, of family, and of the planet itself, offering Ashley a symbol of self-sufficiency and the hope for a long-term future that transcended the brutality of her sale.
The continuity provided by those small objects allowed the sack to survive the upheaval of the Civil War and the following decades, eventually landing in the hands of the third generation, Ruth Middleton.
That's right. Ashley survived the war, gave birth to Rosa, named significantly after the mother she had been torn from, and Rosa then gave birth to Ruth Jones around 1900 in Columbia, South Carolina.
And Ruth Middleton's life trajectory is central to understanding the 20th century Black experience. She was part of the Great Migration.
She was. Seeking better opportunities, safety, and freedom outside the brutal constraints of the Jim Crow South, Ruth moved north to Philadelphia as a teenager in the 1910s. Like countless Black women arriving in northern cities, she initially labored as a domestic servant.
The book also touches on the pressing realities of the early 20th century that influenced her personal life.
Her personal timeline really mirrors the national context. She likely married young during World War I, perhaps spurred to an early marriage to Arthur Middleton, a tire maker, due to pregnancy and the very real fear that her fiancé might not return from service. That need for stability and security was paramount in the segregated northern city.
Well, she worked in the domestic sphere, often in the posh homes of Philadelphia's white elites. She carried a valuable, marketable skill with her from the South, sewing.
And sewing provided a crucial pathway for Black women toward a degree of stability and professionalism. It helped them enter the nascent Black middle class. Ruth used this skill professionally, but she also applied it to the ultimate act of preservation, the embroidery on the sack.
And the medium she chose, embroidery, is highly significant in relation to her social mobility and simultaneously her act of resistance.
It is. Embroidery was deeply associated with Victorian femininity and white gentility. It was practiced by elite white women as a marker of leisure, signifying that they were too refined for manual labor. By skillfully embroidering this epic Black family history, a history of trauma and bondage, onto the humble cotton sack, Ruth achieved a fascinating dual purpose.
She mirrored the ideals of the dominant society while undercutting its racial exclusion.
Exactly. She was gaining respect as a skilled matron in the Black upper crust, demonstrating proficiency in a genteel art form. Yet she used that very craft of gentility to infuse it with the raw, painful history of Black bondage and resilience, making an indelible claim on her family's legacy. She reclaimed the craft.
And we see this powerful link between fine needle arts and Black women in that era, too.
Oh, yes. There was a deep appreciation for the craft, seen in groups like the Pansy Embroidery Club or the famous prize-winning quilts created by Harriet Powers. For Ruth, sewing was far more than domestic work. The sources describe it as a quiet, fleeting freedom and, crucially, healing work.
Healing work.
The very act of sewing, a suture, is a stitch. Ruth was symbolically repairing the historical tear caused by separation.
And the embroidery itself is a piece of historical testimony. It's poetic and interpretive, not just a factual account.
It's deeply emotive. The text she chose to stitch is concise, powerful, and utterly condemnatory of slavery. The line, "She never saw her again," is a clear moral indictment of the system. It's a devastating three-word summary of generational trauma and irrevocable loss.
But the narrative is anchored by the central, enlarged, emotive line, "It be filled with my love always."
That line is crucial. The fact that Ruth chose to embroider that enduring emotive tone, specifically enlarging and centering the word love, is central to the sack's meaning, and the prominent use of the color red for that quoted line adds another layer of interpretation.
What are the potential cultural interpretations of using that bright red thread?
The book suggests two primary possibilities. First, the use of red might echo the practice of emphasizing the red-letter words of Jesus in the Bible, giving Rose's statement this divine weight and authority, almost as a sacred promise.
Okay, and the second?
Second, and perhaps more deeply rooted in African-American folk tradition, it may refer to the practice of magical folk religion conjure bags or grizz bags. In this practice, red flannel was often preferred for bundling sacred objects invested with protective or destructive properties.
So Ruth uses the brightest, biggest red line to emphasize the protective, powerful, and culturally layered meanings locked within her narrative. She's transforming the sack into a shield.
Exactly. And this act of preserving and telling the story served a profound psychological function for Ruth herself. Storytelling and witnessing is a recognized therapeutic process for trauma. By recounting the past painful events, the speaker begins to move beyond the immediate devastation.
It changes the teller's role in the story.
It moves the teller beyond the constraining role of victim and into the empowering stance of a witness. This allows the storyteller, Ruth, to gain emotional and analytical control over the traumatic memory. The repetitive nature of the stitching, mirroring the repetition of the tale across generations, helps to condense the painful narrative and yield greater understanding and, ultimately, peace.
The sack is not just history, it is therapy made tangible.
That's a perfect way to put it.
When we look at the complete journey of the small cotton sack, from Rose's desperate act to Ashley's survival to Ruth's act of witnessing, the object is clearly more than a relic. It is, as the sources call it, an example of an ethic of bequest.
Yes, where love is made manifest in the preservation of things passed on.
It's a phenomenal example of how African-American survivors of slavery became profound theorists of the mercurial nature of things.
They did. They intimately understood the instability of the boundaries between human and non-human property. The sack, in turn, is an object that functions like a medicine bundle. It holds physical items like hair and seeds and emotional truths like love and trauma in a particular powerful relation to one another. It connects us directly to their experience.
This three-generation story, Rose, Ashley, and Ruth, transforms a small piece of cotton into a modern parable that asks us to confront our own relationship with resilience.
The story serves as a complex parable of resilience. It refuses to romanticize the past, it never minimizes the pain of the trauma, but it also doesn't imply a predetermined dystopian future.
It holds those two truths in tension.
It does, and it encourages us to consider our own contemporary carrying capacity, our ability individually and collectively to bear both the burdens of historical and present-day trauma and the gifts of fortitude passed down to us.
And the book ensures that this historical trauma is not relegated solely to the past. It's linked powerfully to modern challenges.
It connects the historical urgencies faced by Rose and Ashley, chattel bondage and familial separation, to powerful modern urgencies. The book explicitly draws comparisons between Ashley's condition and the federal mistreatment of separated migrant children at the border.
Wow!
Those modern children shared Ashley's condition of being torn from a parent in a state of extreme threat, experiencing mental health effects described by modern psychology as on par with beating and torture.
So the story of Rose, Ashley, and Ruth demands that we understand that the struggles for family integrity and recognition, They are not over.
Not at all. The perseverance of these women, Rose protecting, Ashley carrying, Ruth witnessing, demands a long-term, big-picture, cooperative response to our current existential threats, whether those threats are economic inequality, political exclusion, or environmental crises. The sack is a mandate to carry love forward, just as Ruth wrote.
This has been a deeply moving and analytically rich discussion. Thank you for joining us for this installment of the mini book podcast, African American Books Edition, analyzing all that she carried. The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake by Tiya Miles.
We truly hope this analysis encourages you to pick up the book and delve into the material yourself. It is an incredible work of historical recovery, emotional understanding, and a testament to the power of family across time.
If you enjoyed learning about this incredible piece of history, we encourage you to subscribe and tell others about this podcast.
Also, we would love to hear from you. Please suggest in the comments or wherever you listen what books you would like to hear covered in future episodes.
Thank you for subscribing and listening.